Hello, everyone, and welcome to the New York State Youth Justice Institute's Forum on COVID-19 and Youth, Beyond 2020, the Next Normal. My name is Giza Lopez, and I am the Executive Director of the YJI. We have a diverse audience here today. Many of you come from local and state governments in New York and all over the country, as well as universities, nonprofits, and research centers from near and far. If you joined us yesterday for our discussion on courts, welcome back. Yesterday, we asked you to tell us what you were taking away from the forum. Right about now, you should see your responses. Front and center, bright, bold, and blue, was the notion of cultural humility. I'll let you sit with that word cloud for a minute. Cultural humility was lifted up yesterday, and it's this idea of being other-oriented, to commit to self-evaluation and to redress power imbalances. I think that connecting with this notion will be especially relevant for today's session as we shift our focus to trauma and healing. Besides a full house here in Zoom, with about 600 of you registering for today's panel, we are absolutely honored to have a stellar roster of experts to lead our discussions over the next few hours. My many thanks to all of the forum's panelists, moderators, and to our fantastic keynote speakers, Dr. Isaiah Pickens, New York State Chief Judge Janet DeFiore, and Professor Gary Younge for sharing their brainpower, their experience, and their passion with us. My thanks also to the entire YJI team, and especially to Avery Irons and Alicia Gagnon. Their dedication and thoughtfulness in organizing this event already makes it a success. I am also grateful to Dana Peterson, Michelle Ellis, Vince Dilio, Tony Galveo, and Kristen Conklin for all their help and thought partnership. Last, but in no way least, many thanks to our partners at the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services, the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, SUNY Albany, and to the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group for their unwavering support. Exactly 1 year ago, as New York had become the American epicenter of the pandemic, in a virtual forum much like this one, the YJI brought together researchers, policymakers, community representatives, practitioners, funders, and advocates to answer a fundamental question. Are the kids all right? And further, we asked, are all kids all right? As we centered our discussions on the pandemic's disparate impacts on historically marginalized populations, including youth of color, youth with behavioral health needs, LGBTQIA+ youth, youth with disabilities, and immigrant youth. We would like to share with you a few insights from that national cross-stakeholder conversation. Right about now, our wonderful team will queue up that video.
So the pandemic is not just a public health crisis, it's a racial and economic one. The people most impacted by this, our youth, our elderly, is because of the racial, health, and economic disparities that we have in this country.
There's not an equal distribution of this. So again, an encouragement to look individually at each family, look individually at each child, to really think about what the impact is. We don't want broad strokes because that does not really help us be prescriptive in terms of what families need.
We can't be like reactionary. We can't just talk about only the risk and not about prevention, like not about what foundation is needed to like help make a child whole.
High-speed internet access or having equipment is a basic right. You're realizing that folks can't communicate. They can't be part of this new civil rights movement because they simply don't have the materials they need, materials that should really be as basic as food and water.
Reform is never applied toward communities uniformly. And you can't expect the same impact on communities that have long histories of violence and oppression from the state.
I created a 3-person evaluation team to review the youth that were currently in detention at the time of the shutdown, so to speak, using these revised admission criteria to determine which youth may be released to alternatives to detention. And this resulted in a 95% of my detained population being released. And I want to point something out. To this day, not a single one of them have disrupted or reoffended. And that's extremely important because it begs the question, should I have allowed them in the first place?
Families are experiencing loss, and I think they haven't had time to grieve. And I think that that's going to be an issue going forward. There was a lot of people who lost their life during this pandemic, and families are going to have to find a way to grieve, this process because they weren't able to say goodbye to their loved ones.
One of the things we know is that when people belong, first of all, their capacity to resist trauma is greater. That is, the effect of an event is less likely to be traumatizing if you are in a space where you belong. And part of belonging is just that, is to be really seen. There's a South African word called sabawanu, and it's translated, I see you. It's also translated, the God in me sees the God in you. But for many young people, especially young people of color, they don't feel seen, so they don't have that network.
So we can be resilient, but let's not mistake at all that we are not hurt by the things that we go through. And I think sometimes resilience can be used in a way to mismanage the trauma and the punishment that these children are going through.
Part of what we need to be talking about in this conversation is that reforms can only go so far. We have to be ready for them. Our heart has to be ready for them.
This pandemic has shown us that changing our reliance on juvenile detention is possible.
In New York now, a year later, we dare to begin seeing an end to this pandemic, marked by increased access to the vaccine and by revisions to social isolation policies. We also dare to believe that the age-old calls for racial justice that echoed loudly in 2020 may have begun to resonate, or at least they did so in one courtroom in Minneapolis. All in all, we've reached what feels very much like a transitional, perhaps even transformative moment. In moments like this, the ancient Romans looked to the god Janus, who had one head looking forwards and one head looking backwards for guidance. Janus's great power was to see both the past and the future, to see inward and outward all at the same time. At moments of change, he took lessons from what he saw before and planned for tomorrow. As we emerge from our pandemic lives, what do we see in the future? Do we see a next normal for our schools, teaching children in new ways, or do we see regression and exclusion from lost education? Do we see a better normal for our criminal legal system, which has found new ways to deliver justice, or do we see old inequities replicating themselves? Do we see our youth whole, healthy in body and mind, at peace, civically engaged, ready and eager to learn? Or do we see our children, our teens, our young adults contending with wounds exacerbated by the pandemic and caused by racism, ableism, and other isms that are endemic to our health, education, and justice systems. To prepare for this year's forum, we convened 3 groups of experts to help us prioritize what youth really needs in this transitional moment, in the immediate future, and permanently. One group focused on education, one on courts, and one on trauma and healing. We asked them, what questions should we be asking as we move beyond the pandemic? Who can help us look forward while looking backward? We're grateful to everyone who served on those panels. In a way, they were our Januses. Today's event, which you're about to see, is certainly made better by their insights and hard work. The rest of the work is really up to you, our audience. Your job today is to listen and watch, ask questions, and learn from what others show you. We're scholars, educators, community members, government officials, youth and family representatives. We each have our own experiences of this pandemic, and we all have thoughts about what can or should come next. But this event will work best if, like Janus, you look not only within yourself, but also outwards to what others are showing you. If you reflect on what's behind us and help us craft a path forward. Perhaps a place to start is to try and imagine the world as it is experienced right now by our young people. To those of us with kiddos at home, we may have seen firsthand the toll the pandemic has taken on our teens' mental health, or the inevitable learning loss that came with the shift to online learning, especially for our kids with disabilities. But we don't need to reach for personal examples. Our young people's trauma, their viewpoint is painfully public. A year and a week ago, at age 17, Darnella Frazier showed us a video of what she saw during this pandemic. Walking to the corner store with her little cousin, they witnessed the murder of George Floyd, a Black man, by Derek Chauvin, a white police officer. And when Darnella shared that video, she showed us all something that we might not have seen otherwise, or worse, that we might have chosen not to see. As we look back to look forward, let us look within ourselves, but let us also always try to remember what others, what young people like Darnella are showing us. Let us get started. Today's keynote, Professor Gary Younge, will put to test our ability to exercise cultural humility as he invites us to engage with yet another source of constant pain for our young people, especially young people of color, gun violence. And he pushes us to expand our viewpoint and to think about how this violence and the racism that buttresses it is not confined to American borders. It is endemic and it is global. At this point, I'd like to invite our former YJI scholar, Casey Pav, to share the virtual stage with me and to introduce us to today's keynote speaker, Professor Gary Younge. Over the past 18 months or so, the YJI was the professional home of about 30 undergraduate and graduate students. But Casey was our very first one, and we couldn't be more proud of her as she moves on to law school. So if you would join me in chat congratulating Casey on her new journey, I am sure she would appreciate it. And with that, Casey, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Casey Pav, and I am a former scholar here at the Youth Justice Institute. I would like to join Dr. Lopez's thanks for coming today, and I hope you'll help me extend a warm welcome to our keynote speaker today, Gary Younge. We are very much looking forward to sharing his recorded presentation with you all, and we know that you're looking forward to hearing his remarks. But before starting, we would like to introduce him and share with you some of his many accomplishments. Mr. Younge is an award-winning author, journalist, and professor of sociology at the University of Manchester. He has written for a wide range of publications, including but not limited to the New York Review of Books, the Financial Times, and The Guardian, where he was formerly the United States correspondent before becoming editor-at-large. His contributions to radio and television are just as diverse, covering a wide array of topics both in the United States and the United Kingdom. His contributions to journalism have won Mr. Younge significant acclaim throughout the years. In fact, he has won more awards than we have time to list in this short introduction. His most recent accolades include the 2018 Society of Editors recognition as Broadsheet Feature Writer of the Year, and the 2017 James Aronson Career Achievement Award from the City University of New York. His work in journalism has consistently been recognized as combining insightful analysis, professional integrity, and moral vision. Within his publications, Mr. Younge offers a transatlantic analysis of the most pertinent political and social issues currently facing the United States. The most recent of his 5 publications, Another Day in the Death of America, has won significant acclaim. The work was awarded the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize and was shortlisted for 6 other awards in the United States and the United Kingdom. Just last year, Mr. Younge left The Guardian to become a professor in the sociology department at Manchester University, and he is currently a visiting professor at London South Bank University. He has been made an honorary fellow of both the British Academy and Cardiff University. Throughout his career, he has been awarded 5 honorary doctorates from Warwick University, University of Arts in London, Heriot-Watt University, London South Bank University, and Mount Holyoke University, who stated, "We are indebted to you for going off the beaten track and purposely veering into the spaces not sought by other journalists." We echo those thoughts as we offer you this keynote address in which Professor Younge leads us through a discussion of youth violence in the United Kingdom and the United States, the role of journalism in influencing such narratives, and a challenge to move beyond a very comfortable and too narrow focus on the presumed faults of individual youth and families, as opposed to harder conversations about systemic and structural faults. With that being said, we will now present Gary Younge, who has kindly pre-recorded his presentation for us today, all the way from his home in London.
I want to thank you at the Youth Justice Initiative for this kind invitation and for your generous introduction. Our understanding of what constitutes news is supposed to be self-explanatory. When a dog bites a man, and in the parlance it is a man, they say that's not news because it happens so often. But if a man bites a dog, then that's news because it's so rare. But over the past few years of covering particularly issues of youth violence, but not only, I've wondered if there might not be an addendum to that adage, a qualifying footnote to what seems like the obvious. Because sometimes events derive their news potential and their potential news value precisely because they happen so often. There are things, indeed, that happen with such regularity and predictability that journalists have simply ceased to recognize their news value, not least if those things are least likely to happen to the people who are most likely to be journalists. And therefore, much of what we've come to accept as commonplace has dulled our curiosity to why so much of what is commonplace is unacceptable. So there can be value in at times asking, why do dogs keep biting people? Who owns these dogs? And why do the same people keep getting bitten? Now, I want to illustrate what that value is with examples from a book I wrote in 2016 called Another Day in the Death of America, and a series I ran in The Guardian in 2017 called Beyond the Blade. The book, Another Day in the Death of America, is premised on the fact that every day, on average, at the time that I wrote the book, 7 children or teens were being shot dead in America. And so I picked a day at random, November the 23rd, 2013, and then set out over the next 2 years to find out who these kids were, seeking out everyone who knew them, from their parents to their pastors and basketball coaches. 10 kids were shot dead that day across America. The youngest was 9, and the eldest was just a few days shy of his 20th birthday. The journalism series sets out to cover a similar cohort and a different tragedy: all the children and teens killed by knives in Britain over a year, mapping the number of children who were killed and also looking at the themes that emerged as a result of their death. In Britain, when it comes to what's known as knife crime, it turns out the facts were quite elusive. Crimes committed with knives are nothing new. Shakespeare's plays were full of them. But knife crime as a phenomenon is relatively recent. But a survey of the national press in 2016 found that the only time that the term knife crime was used in the national press was in relation to black boys being killed in London. But it was staggering when I started that series to discover that given the amount of column inches devoted to the issue, national data on the number of children and teens killed by knives in any given year was not publicly available. So while knife crime in Britain, particularly as it affects young people, has been the subject of a national debate for well over a decade, our awareness of its true scale is limited, our grasp of its trajectory is only approximate, and coverage of it is erratic. In short, as a nation, we are conscious that there is something out there known as knife crime, but as yet we lack any coherent or enduring national response, and instead have fallen back on flawed assumptions underpinned by prejudice, ignorance, and political expediency. In his landmark book, Public Opinion, Walter Lippmann wrote, "Our opinions cover a bigger space, a longer reach of time, a greater number of things than we can directly observe. They have, therefore, to be pieced together out of what others have reported." And the trouble is that when it comes to things like knife crime or gun violence, the reporting is neither neutral nor consistent. And in the absence of facts, prejudice and presumption move in. One thing that became clear during the series on knife crime is that it's a construct. It doesn't simply mean, as one might reasonably expect, crimes committed with knives. It denotes a certain type of crime committed by a certain type of criminal in a certain kind of context. It is racialized. In 2017, then Prime Minister Tony Blair told an audience in Cardiff, "The black community, the vast majority of whom in these communities are decent, law-abiding people, horrified of what's happening, need to be mobilized in denunciation of this gang culture that is killing innocent young black kids. But we won't stop this by pretending it isn't young black kids doing it." It's also understood to be primarily urban and gendered. Now, some of these preconceptions bear some relationship to reality, but some don't. Thanks to a series of FOIA requests, Freedom of Information requests in Britain, the Guardian's data team managed to prize the information from the state, revealing basic facts about who was most vulnerable to knife crime. We discovered that while black kids are overrepresented among knife fatalities, the overwhelming majority of kids killed by knives in Britain aren't black. That is not true for London, but outside London, they don't even constitute 1 in 5. And London comprises just half of all the kids who were killed. So, some people aren't counted, and even when they do count, they don't necessarily count for much. This also became clear in reporting on gun deaths in America. One of the boys who died on a day I was covering for the book was Samuel Brideman, a 16-year-old who was shot dead in South Dallas while walking down the street with his friend. Under the headline, "Teen Fatally Shot While Walking Down Street," the Dallas Morning News wrote a single paragraph. They didn't have an awful lot to go on. In the days to come, there was no profile, no testimony from his school friends or teachers, no sense of who he was, let alone why he was killed. A young man was removed from the planet and he got just a paragraph. How can that be? Well, Samuel Corday Brideman, known to his family as Day Day, was a sweet-tempered, fragile young man, a homebody, whose best friend was his younger sister Whitney, who was often as not fought his battles for him. Just coming out of his shell, he'd recently been elected vice president of his school council. The women in his extended family described him alternatively as the son they never had or the son they wished they'd had. Such was the short life whose death received such short shrift in the Dallas media. I spoke to the reporter who'd written the paragraph. To be fair, it was her task to record it, not to follow it up. So when the day was done, she handed over the stories to the regular crime team, which would take up the weekend stories that they thought were worth running with. And Samuel's death didn't make the cut. That didn't surprise her. Pleasant Grove, where Samuel was shot, is poor, black, and on the south side of Dallas, and is disparagingly known as Unpleasant Grove. Shootings were common there, she confirmed. People are desensitized to it. They reason that's just where bad things happen, she told me. Now, I heard this refrain often when talking to American journalists who covered that day's shootings. Clearly, I was the only one who called them to follow up on the story. And they would kindly rifle through their notes and tell me what they knew and if they'd been to the crime scene, what they'd seen. Invariably, if I asked if they had any contact details for family members I could speak to, or if there'd been any developments in the investigation, they would explain, somewhat matter-of-factly, why they had moved on. Unfortunately, homicides are not uncommon in that area, said one. Unless something unexpected happened, it just wouldn't be the kind of story we'd follow up on, said another. As a journalist, I understand this. I have no idea, for example, what happened to Jesus Joseph, an 8-year-old Haitian boy whom I met in the Dominican Republic in 2005. He had turned up at a refugee center with his neck twisted from carrying heavy loads and his shoulders bearing welts from the mistreatment of the family who had bought him and used him as a domestic slave. I write this with neither pride nor guilt. There is a level of detachment inherent and arguably necessary in journalism. Without it, one would become emotionally depleted. Moreover, one is constantly gauging what more there is to say and who would be listening if you said it. Outlets have limited resources. Editors have to justify budgets for keeping you in a certain place or sending you back to trace each individual story, which in turn must be balanced against what other news stories you might be missing. Journalism is not social work. And even social workers, to be effective, must move on. But that said, these are little more than rationalizations for how I and other journalists exercise our relative power. We choose whose stories are told, whom we go back to, and where these resources are deployed. And those choices aren't objective. They are made on the basis of what stories we subjectively consider are worthy of being told at any given time. The fact that most media outlets are commercial enterprises is, of course, a factor. The more a story costs, and the less likely it is to bring in readers and therefore revenue, the less likely institutions are to invest resources in it. But it is not the only factor, and generally not the most important one. To no small extent, what the media does is replicate and transmit the inequalities that exist elsewhere. Journalists are more likely, on both sides of the Atlantic, to be white, wealthy, and educated than the population at large. And that means they are less likely to live in the areas where gun deaths and knife deaths happen, and less likely to know people to whom they happen. Journalistically, this remoteness comes at a severe price. They literally don't know the people they are writing about. And those journalistic choices have an impact on how much pressure there is on police to find the perpetrators, on the criminal justice system to prosecute, on judges to sentence, and on politicians to legislate. None of us work in a vacuum. In Ways of Seeing, John Berger wrote, "The way we see things is affected by what we know and what we believe. And the relation between what we see and what we know is never settled. What is truly unsettling is that when some people see that a black kid has been shot or stabbed, they are far more comfortable blaming the kid and his family than the society that allows guns to circulate so freely and neighborhoods to decline so completely." While writing the book, I saw the degree to which people who live in poor black and brown neighborhoods are barely understood as people at all. They are referred to as though their children are inherently feral and the parents inherently negligent, as though the parents don't love their kids and the kids don't love life. Victims become divided into the deserving and the undeserving. The first comment following the short online story of Samuel's death came from a woman called Marge Vargas, who wrote, "I have 2 adult kiddos, and there's no way they would have been out walking the streets after dark, and I always know where they were. I don't blame the victims, but all parents could do better." A mother had just lost her child, and this was her contribution to the discussion. There was no empathy there. The assumption is this simply could not have happened to her because she is a better parent. The fact was that Samuel was accompanying his friend Denzel on the 10-minute walk back to his grandmother's house after a family night, drinking cocoa, playing Uno, and watching a movie with Audrey, Samuel's mum, his sister, and Denzel. The worst thing that Samuel did that night was cheat at Uno. His mother, a loving and attentive parent, knew exactly where he was. She just couldn't save him. And this is how we come to a stage, in America certainly, and in Britain somewhat, where Black parents have to make the case for why their unarmed child should not have been shot. This is where distance and the challenge of empathy comes in. The further you are from living in a community where a child might be murdered, the less likely you are to see it as a priority, its victims as newsworthy, or solutions as possible. Put bluntly, a child being killed is a far more newsworthy event for those who know the child than for those who don't and are never likely to. It illustrates why news values are not an objective account of the most important things that have happened in any given time and place. They are simply the sum total of the priorities and received wisdom of those who provide the news. And those who provide the news are not a representative group. What I'm not saying here, and I couldn't emphasize this enough, is that the rich should not be allowed to write about the poor, or white people should not be able to write about non-white people. That way, madness lies. What I am saying in parentheses is that in the absence of diverse newsrooms, these problems become more acute. The point of having a critical mass of a range of classes, ethnicities, religions, regions, and a gender balance in your newsroom is not to make you feel good. It is not so that you can look different and yet act the same, because that might provide photo opportunities, but not equal opportunities. And in the words of Angela Davis, that is a model of diversity as the difference that brings no difference and the change that brings no change. The idea is that so that you can act and operate differently and more effectively. This is less the product of malign neglect in journalism than the unconscious omissions born from the dead weight of power and privilege that makes the poor and dark invisible. In short, there are places in almost every American city where children and teens are expected to get shot. Areas where the deaths of young people by gunfire doesn't contradict a city's general understanding of how the world should work, but confirms it. To raise children there, whether they're involved in criminal activity or not, is to incorporate those odds into your daily life. Every single Black parent that I interviewed in the book had feared that this might happen to their child. Audrey, Samuel's mum, said, "I didn't think it would be him, I thought it would be his brother." But just as Samuel's story revealed America's blind spots, so the story of the fatal stabbing of Kwamari Serunkuma Barnes in Willesden revealed many of Britain's. Kwamari, who was 15, was killed on the 23rd of January 2017 outside his school. Though he looked younger, Kwamari was, by most accounts, an old soul. He sang Bob Marley and the Wailers tunes like other kids might sing nursery rhymes, could cook a full roast dinner for the family, and stayed up all night on the 2015 general election, matching the results against expectations. He was singing to himself as he left school that day, only to be chased by another 15-year-old. He ran screaming for help, shouting, "I'm going to get stabbed." Later that evening, his short life ended when one of 3 stab wounds pierced a lung. His death was front page news in the London Evening Standard for 2 days running. and was covered less prominently in the nationals. The trial of his assailant came some 5 months later, starting just after the election, which produced a hung parliament. So there was a lot going on. Nonetheless, given the initial interest in Kwamari's death, I imagine that there would be considerable interest in what came of the trial. But it turned out that for most of the trial, only myself and a film crew doing a documentary about murders in general were there. On the day of the verdict, there was just me and a court reporter. Watching the 15-year-old be convicted of Kwamari's murder in the dock that day, I wrote, "It's difficult to know what justice looks like when one 15-year-old is dead and then another is on trial for their murder. Naturally, you want the perpetrator to be punished. But if the perpetrator is also a child, then on one level, it seems as if some broader, deeper, more intractable injustice has already been committed. One thrashes about, mostly in vain, for an institution, service, or agency to blame, for an intervention that could have helped, or a moral safety net with smaller holes that might have caught him. There are preferable outcomes, but there are no good outcomes. If the accused is found not guilty, then either the killer is still out there or he just got away with it. If he is guilty, then one child is still dead and the other's life is ruined." A few months later, after the accused had been convicted and then confessed, I managed to reach the mother of the boy who had killed Kwamari. I felt this was important because for the most part, fatal knife crime is reduced to a crude morality play in which the young perpetrators are all but invisible. Abstracted from parents or community, we meet them in the dock defined by their crime. They are not children who have killed, but killers. Not people who have done something monstrous, but monsters. They stand reduced to this one act. They killed a child. Their anonymity is protected by law, so we don't see their pictures or hear from their parents usually. By the time the trial is over, we have no idea where they have come from, why or how, only where they're going. Prison. Without face, family or friend, they are not children, but cautionary tales. But in order to heed the caution in these tragic crimes, we must first restore the humanity of those who commit them. Failing to do so is not only morally problematic, it is counterproductive. The best chance we have of sparing the next child from an early death is finding out why the last one died. There are lots of lessons, but none can be learned if they do not start from the fact that the murder was committed by a child, not a metaphor. When I found his mum, I discovered that the boy who killed Kwamari had been a happy kid who graduated as a toddler from Finding Nemo to Lion King, deciding early on that he wanted to be a vet. A very active child, in later years he became an accomplished athlete and footballer who gained the attention of professional scouts. While in primary school, his dad was deported, and this was the first time his mum noticed him getting angry and withdrawn. She tried to get help from child and adolescent mental health services at the time, but was told he didn't meet the threshold. At secondary school, he seemed to be doing well academically, but before long was expelled after a physical altercation with a teacher, and from there he was sent to a pupil referral unit, or a special school. It soon became clear that the search for some broader injustice that might help shed light on Kwamari's death would not have been in vain. Indeed, she could document his mother in painstaking detail, requests for help that either were not answered, were not met, or where the response was inadequate, even as she warned of the possible consequences. On the 23rd of March 2015, she sent an email to her MP with the heading, "Please help me save my son." She described how the behavior of her then 13-year-old son was, I quote, "deteriorating rapidly, involving himself with the wrong crowd," and her fears for the impact this could have on his siblings. She detailed how she had enrolled herself in parenting classes, consulted with social workers and psychologists, sought referrals for mental health assessments, requested to move him from his school, and asked help to move her family out of London, but she felt she was getting nowhere. She ended the email, "All I want is for my children not to become another statistic, and would like all the help possible to stop this from happening." A few months later, she warned a meeting of social workers in the London borough where she lived, if we don't do something, he's going to either end up dead or someone's going to end up in a body bag. She tried. We don't know if that murder could have been prevented, but we know that not everything was tried. At the bottom of many of the responses from Brent Council, where she lived, came the impersonal sign-off. We need to save £54 million over the next 2 years. Find out more about our budget consultation events and have your say before February the 4th, 2015. There is a structural context to these deaths that is willfully ignored by journalists. We must, of course, talk about personal responsibility, but there is also collective responsibility, particularly when it comes to children and youth. They are a protected category. As a society, there is a general view that we have a societal responsibility for them. And the fact is that as a society, we have been reneging on that responsibility. In Britain, for the last 10 years, we have been enduring swingeing austerity. In 2011, the government scrapped the educational maintenance allowance, a £30 weekly grant, that's about $50, to low-income students who are in school or college. Funding for the education of 16 to 19-year-olds fell by 14% in 4 years. Between 2010 and 2017, there was a £387 million, that's about £500 million cut in youth services. And between 2012 and 2016, 603 youth clubs were closed. Meanwhile, a starved National Health Service is unable to adequately provide mental health assistance to the young. Few would make the claim that there is a direct, seamless causal link between these cuts and the rise in violent crime. But nor can anyone reasonably claim that no one can reasonably claim that this is the exclusive reason for the increase, but nor can you plausibly claim that it is irrelevant either. Once the government had made the political choices that effectively produce a crisis, it then expects the police to establish order and calm over the stability and police that crisis. Police say young people who are carrying knives increasingly do not do so through gang affiliation, but for protection. Youth workers say they are scared and don't trust the police to protect them. In short, as a nation, Britain is actively and consciously underfunding its kids. And these cuts fall more heavily on the poor, and since the dark are more likely to be poor, on those who are black and brown. These deaths are all too often understood as a crisis of culture and crime, while the economic and political decisions that help create the context for them go unchallenged. In the event that the media wants to cover these stories, they hone in on the boy in the dock and the boy in the body bag. They don't seem too interested in how they got there and what might be done to prevent others destined for the same fate. They rarely stick around for the trial, ask for anything more than vengeance from the grieving and repentance from the guilty. But the fact is that if you make it harder for young people to stay in education, harder for them to get treatment if they are mentally ill, harder for them to find safe and productive places to spend leisure time with each other and with adults who are trained to work with them, then we shouldn't be surprised to see an increase in social problems among the young, including social violence in general and knife crime in particular. As the boy who killed Kumari's mother put it, is he responsible for his actions? Yes. Did I try everything I could? Yes. Well, we failed. Yes. But every now and then, an event will force the media to take some of these underlying structural issues seriously. The fire that killed so many at Grenfell Tower Block in London, Hurricane Katrina, or George Floyd. And in those moments, the shock illustrates how the media episodically discovers these daily realities in much the same way that teenagers discover sex, urgently, earnestly, voraciously, and carelessly, with great self-indulgence, but precious little self-awareness. They've always been aware of it, but somehow when confronted with it, it nonetheless takes them by surprise, and then their surprise becomes the news. For these enduring structural crises stand like the firm foundations of an iceberg against which the coverage of these so-called news moments collide and ultimately crash. After the St. Louis suburb of Ferguson, Missouri, went up in flames in 2015, the Department of Justice conducted a report into how the city was being run that I believe any enterprising journalist could have produced themselves if they had not been inured to this kind of systemic discrimination. It revealed the extent to which the Black population in the town lived in a state of tyranny and extortion at the hands of the local polity. Among other things, the DOJ found that between 2007 and 2014, one woman was arrested twice, spent 6 days in jail, and paid $550 as a result of one instance of illegal parking for which she was originally charged $151. 7 years after the original infraction, she still owed $541. This was how the town of Ferguson raised its revenue. It was not a glitch in the system, it was the system. And then there was a 14-year-old boy found in an abandoned building who was chased down by a dog which bit his ankle and his left arm as he protected his face. The boys say officers kicked him in the head and then laughed about it afterwards. Officers say they thought he was armed. He wasn't. DOJ investigators found that every time a police dog bit someone, that someone was Black. And so it turns out that sometimes dog bites man really is the story. The trouble is, journalists keep missing it. Thank you.
Our thanks to Professor Younge for broadening our perspective today and for his timely and quite moving message. If you haven't an opportunity to read his book yet, Another Day in the Death of America, I urge you to do so, and the YJI team will put a link in chat to that book. All right. For those of you in the audience, when you first registered for the forum, we asked you to tell us what healing means to you. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a little over 600 people registered for this session today, and about 450 somewhat unique answers to that question. So we've compiled your answers into a video. We'll share that with you momentarily. But we also prepared an interactive activity for you for right now. At this point, or at any time between now and the end of today's event, you can follow the link in the chat and you can tell us in one word what you've taken away from today's forum. Your contributions will be automatically added to a word cloud that we hope to share with you when we wrap things up today. The instructions on how to participate should also be on the screen, and we would love, love, love to hear from all of you. Before we move on to the panel discussions, as promised, we will leave you with your answers to the registration question, what healing is to you, followed by a brief break. Now would be a good time to stretch, grab a snack, take a bio break, and refuel for the panel discussion that will begin momentarily. Reiterated thanks from us at the YJI for you being here. See you soon.
Good morning. If you're just joining us, welcome and thank you. We are taking a short break and will be back momentarily. If you're just joining us, welcome and thank you. We are taking a short break and will be back momentarily.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We will now move on to what I'm sure will be a stimulating panel discussion on trauma and healing. Let me begin by introducing each of our panelists as well as our moderator. It is my pleasure to invite Saafir Northington to share this virtual stage with us. Just last Saturday, Saafir graduated from Canisius College, and he's on his way to grad school. And he's a staff member at the Erie County Restorative Justice Coalition. A shout out to folks from the Erie County Restorative Justice Coalition who are in the virtual crowd. Welcome and thanks for being here. Saafir's work focuses on youth engagement and leadership development, facilitating circles and presenting workshops for the organization. Welcome, Saafir. Congratulations on your graduation, and I'm sure the audience will be sending their best wishes in the chat also. We're also delighted to have with us John Johnson. John is Program Manager for the Supervision and Treatment Services for Juvenile Program and the Office of Community Partnerships Performance Review Unit within OCFS. That's a mouthful. Did I get it all right, John? Hope so. He has supported youth at various levels of justice system involvement throughout his career, holding positions in juvenile detention facilities, foster homes, and overseeing community-based supervision programs. He is also a technical assistance and coordination team member at the Partnership for Youth Justice. It is wonderful to have you, John. Next up is Shalain Garcia, Criminal Justice Policy Analyst at the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services at the Office of Youth Justice. Shalain is an alumna of the University at Albany, who transitioned to her current line of work after spending several years working as a probation officer. She's now able to build on that experience when providing technical assistance in developing and implementing programs across New York State for youth at various levels of system involvement, ranging from prevention all the way to reentry. She hopes to ensure equity throughout the justice system through her focus on racial and ethnic disparities, gender responsiveness, and healing-centered engagement. It's not on her bio, but Shalain is also one of my favorite people in the world, so I'm just going to put it out there. Welcome, Shalain. To round up this stellar panel, I'd like to welcome Mr. Walter Simpkins, the Executive Director of Community Fathers Incorporated. His work in the Capital Region has been instrumental in bringing about positive change in how fathers are viewed by family court. What once started as a once weekly support group has grown into a full service program in no small part due to his commitment and engagement with the community. He has been awarded the Commission of Human Rights Individual Achievement Award, the New York State Assembly Citation for Community Contributions, the Schenectady Foundation Community Hero Award, and the Fathers and Families Coalition of America Innovator and Affiliate of the Year Award. Mr. Simpkins, I live in Schenectady and you're a legend in our county, and I'm sure well beyond. Thank you for all your work and welcome. And to moderate this incredible panel, we're fortunate to have Associate Professor at the University at Albany, Dr. Lani Jones. Dr. Jones is a Black feminist scholar and therapist. She's professor in the School of Social Welfare and the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University at Albany, State University of New York. She has more than 20 years of experience in providing therapy to women of color. Her research and scholarship are concentrated in the area of mental health practice research with a focus on enhancing psychosocial competence among women of color. Her work includes African Americans and depression, signs, awareness, treatments, and interventions. That was published by Roman and Littlefield, and numerous articles and book chapters. Lani, welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you, and good morning. What a great presentation to hear this morning. Looking forward to follow up as we continue our discussion on trauma, healing, racial and ethnic disparities. And just let me make a correction real quick because it's important, especially for many people of color who represent about 4%, I think even 2% at the professorate level. I'll just correct that and let you know that I am a professor, no longer associate professor. So again, welcome, and we will begin this delightful conversation. I'm going to address this question to everyone, and I'll kind of give you the order as we go along. It's a pretty lengthy, so let's begin by thinking about how we've come to regard 2020 as a year of twin pandemics, both the COVID-19 as well as the nation's continuing racial inequity pandemics. So I'm going to ask the panelists from their vantage point how they see these pandemics compounding traditional risk factors for individuals and communities, and how they've impacted the juvenile justice system. I'll also ask you to speak to any intergenerational or gender-based considerations you may have. So we'll start with Saafir, and looking forward to your response.
Good morning. Just glad to be here with everyone. And in response to the question, I would say, in my perspective, resources play the biggest role in how people have been affected through this pandemic. I think, those affected by the juvenile justice system are more often than not, the same communities who are also under-resourced. And so with the COVID pandemic, we've seen a limiting access to those resources that puts an even further strain on those communities and puts them in a critical state. One of the biggest resources that we have to offer is education. And I've seen personally in the Buffalo area, education, take a plummet during the pandemic, almost to rising to the level of its own individual pandemic. Some might say the education disparity has risen to the level of a third pandemic during 2020 and spilling over to 2021. And I think youth specifically who have been impacted by the juvenile justice system have just seen the negative end of both sides of both pandemics, right? And so when you talk about resources, I think that is the biggest risk factor that really compounds every other factor, whether it be, food disparity, resource insecurity, housing insecurity, job insecurity. All of those things are compounded by the limiting of resources during the COVID pandemic. And as far as the racial pandemic goes, I think that's been a pandemic for well over 200 years since the country has started, right? So that's a pandemic that's been going on forever and ever since our country has existed. So, and I think one of the leading contributing factors to it coming to a head in 2020 was the normalization of police violence in the media, right? We limit what our youth can do. We limit the kinds of movies they can watch, PG-13, rated R, but it's difficult to limit our youth's exposure to violence when they can scroll through Instagram and see a police officer shooting a Black man in the back, when they can go onto Facebook and watch a 6-year-old girl being arrested because she was throwing a tantrum. Those are things that our youth have easy access to. And so we wonder why we have so many marginalized youth in the juvenile system. Look at what they're able to view. Look at what they're able to see. Look at how the system is treating them. So those are all, factors when we talk about both of these pandemics coming to a head. And I think the intergenerational piece is that, our youth are watching how the adults are responding to both of these pandemics. So in light of the election, in light of everything that was happening in 2020, youth are watching how adults react to each other. And they're taking that on into themselves, into their spirit, into their being. So I think that is really an indication of where it comes from. If we're watching adults argue and be divisive and all of these things, then of course we're going to see that trickle down to our youth. And the gender base, I think we've all seen in the media, with Breonna Taylor and with the young ladies being arrested for throwing tantrums. There is a gender difference, but it's not mutually exclusive, right? Like everyone is in danger when it comes to these sorts of issues. And I'm complete.
Thank you. Shalain.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for allowing me to share this space. The first thing I'll say is this, sort of the notion of twin pandemics kind of makes me cringe a little bit because there's this underlying notion that racial inequity only became a pandemic in the presence of COVID-19. When we know that racial inequity has long been a pandemic, but the word pandemic was only attached as it occurred simultaneously. So indulge me for a quick second here. So Webster's dictionary defines pandemic as an adjective, right? As something that is occurring over a wide geographic area and typically affecting a significant portion of the population. We would struggle to really find a place in this world where racial inequity is not defined, could not be defined as a pandemic, even when considering racial inequity within a group, like places like the Dominican Republic. So it kind of bothers me when we talk about it only now as a pandemic because the word is now popular, but it's always been a pandemic. And it didn't take COVID-19 to explore the systemic inequities that exist in any human servant system and put them on Front Street to no longer be ignored. It didn't take for us to be in the midst of a pandemic to uncover educational inequities regarding access to things like the internet. And the ability to foster an environment conducive to the learning style for individual youth. The pandemic magnified it. It didn't take the pandemic to uncover racial, ethnic, gender disparities that existed within the juvenile justice system far before this pandemic, because in New York State, we know that youth of color are more likely to be juvenile justice system involved than their white counterparts for the same action that for Black youth is deemed criminal, but for a white youth is deemed excusable. It took the pandemic for us to pay attention. When you consider risk factors, we look at things like unemployment, housing insecurity, food insecurity, but when you consider those in the crux of the pandemic, look at kind of what happened here. What happened is there was an attempt to provide security in those areas for youth and families with their extra money, be it unemployment, which for some families was more money they had ever received working, the moratorium on eviction, and the access to food pantries and food distribution sites. But those were patches on the tire, a temporary fix. So the question becomes, what now, right? What now? Those protections are beginning to be done away with and the holes are exposed again. So finally, I think it's now, as we're moving on the other side of COVID-19, that we need to look closer at how risk factors have been exacerbated by the pandemic as those protections put into place to mitigate the risk factors are disappearing sort of faster than they appear.
Shalain, I want to thank you and appreciate your comment about recognizing the fact that many people of color in the United States and beyond have lived under a pandemic for generations, not just over these past couple of years, but for generations. So thank you. Walter, your comments.
Well, again, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. And I just feel so privileged to, as I sit here and I'm listening to these young panelists speaking, and they're speaking about what I'll speak for myself, what I have observed over the many years that I have been an African American and grown up in projects and have that impact of what that means to me in my life and those that I know and in my community. And actually, this is a continuation of what has to me always been. The difference is now we're in the 21st century and we're watching what we had to deal and struggle with in the 20th century. And that now we're looking at things through a new updated lens, but it's still the same aspects of how our communities are impacted, how we are treated, and the systemic racism that has created that. And most of these communities, like especially in my community, what I saw was that the pandemic or the COVID pandemic it really caused us to be rather isolated and disconnected from one another. And this was something that I believe sometimes things are staged for future use. So whenever they want to shut down communities or whatever, it's kind of a normal thing in our mindsets that will kind of allow us to understand when the government or the police department decide to shut a particular area in the community down because what they feel is that people are starting to cause a violent pandemic. Okay, so therefore, when you go to protests, how do you deal with that? So you use these same techniques. We saw this back in the crack epidemic when all of this mass incarceration went down, and they would come into the community saying it was a war on drugs. And the war on drugs, that sounded, oh yeah, that sounds like we need to get the drugs out the community. But all of a sudden, it had the effect that it got us out the community by mass incarceration and all of these things. So right now, we're just seeing a continuation of how the policies have always existed to keep people of color in a certain aspect of non-participation. So these are the things that we're dealing with. But what I am so proud of that we have young people who have already spoken, who are speaking on behalf of the 21st century, and they are now putting the ideas on which way we need to go. We didn't have outlets like this to speak about what we're facing or any solutions to how we can do it. So I think that what we have to do is we have to reframe everything for where we are going now. Where do we go into, as I keep saying, the 21st century, and especially because everything is shifting. The pandemic also shifted the fathers in the community having to become more of the caretakers of the children of the community. This is a phenomenon that's going down that started before the pandemic, where if you notice, the fathers have had to take a vitally more active role in children and in the lives of what they do and where they go, and all these other things that were originally just prescribed as mothers. So there's a shift in the way we are all operating right now. And I think that's going to cause us to be able to deal with the lines of how we go about addressing this differently. Thank you.
Thank you. And John. John, you're muted.
I'm so appreciative of this opportunity to speak and to listen to what has already been said. It's interesting because many of the things that I have been thinking in my mind, folks have already, Shalain, Walter, Saafir have already kind of touched on it. But I wanted to really posit to everybody's mind around the pandemic. And what I've seen from my vantage point is that what the pandemic has done and what a lot of the furor that we've seen and the righteous furor that we've seen from folks, young people, particularly who are coming up against the racial inequities that have always existed. They were there when I was a young kid growing up in the late 60s, early 70s. I saw it as a kid. I was a young kid in Detroit, Michigan, when the riots occurred in Detroit. And so I experienced that as a 6 or 7 year old, never forgot it to this day. But what I saw with the pandemic is that the connections that we had so diligently tried to start to get between communities and young people, and we were starting to see some production from that, the pandemic severed a lot of those connections. And so folks weren't meeting as much as they used to. Folks weren't getting the help that they needed. Folks weren't able to access opportunities as they once did just 3 or 4 months before. And so you start to see that a lot of those risk factors that we always talk about, some of the, the gang involvement, in these high crime areas, folks weren't able to go another way. They were being, while, like Walter said, while fathers were trying to reach out to young people in the community, there were other people trying to reach out to these young people, and they're not concerned. They weren't concerned about, well, we need to stay away from each other. We got to wear a mask, all that kind of stuff. No, they weren't. They were trying to get people to do untoward things, and so they reached out to our young people. And now we have this proliferation of issues that we once thought we were trying to get a headway on. And so I feel like, what the pandemic did is it caused us to not be as connected as we need to be. And it's really interesting to me when you think about this intergenerational, part of the question about intergenerational issues. And I started in the Office of Children and Family Services way back in the mid-'80s. And when I started in my career in juvenile justice, one of the things that was really prevalent back then was the crack epidemic. And one of the interesting things that I think about is that it was an epidemic to everybody other than the people in the midst of the epidemic. It was more like a pandemic, right? It felt like COVID, right? But it was COVID that lasted for years upon years. And like Walter said, there were no outlets. There were no ways for people to wrestle with this big monster. And so folks have already dealt with that. And then we still are feeling the ramifications of what happened during the crack epidemic even to this day. And so what I think that we need to really be mindful of is that what is going to, and I know we have questions further on that'll talk about this, but we need to get our minds to think about what are the ramifications of what we're dealing with right now with COVID? What are the ramifications of the struggles that are going on to try to change the inequities? Because we can't ever go back to a point where people didn't know, people don't understand. We're in an information, we have so much ready information, we have to start understanding that it's what we do from this point forward, because for a lot of folks, this is just like Walter said, this is a continuation of difficulties that they've experienced for several generations. It's nothing different. I'm done.
Thank you, John. Wow, we're having a great conversation here and looking forward to opening up to the audience. Don't forget to place your questions into the question and answer box, and we'll get to those shortly. So as we move forward, it was discussed earlier about that we asked all registrants to offer a word that describes healing for them. Over 400 different words were received. So I'm asking the panelists as they can speak to how you define healing, as well as healing-centered engagement in your work, and provide any concrete examples may be helpful to the rest of the audience as they begin and continue their healing work in the community. So Saafir, we'll start with you once again. Thank you.
Thank you. I think from my perspective, healing needs to be proactive. I think the pandemics have shown just how reactive our system is and how responsive our system is, but we need to get ahead of that curve. And so we need to get better at understanding what is causing all of this harm, what is causing all of this conflict, what is causing all of this trauma, and restrict the knife, right? It's easy to put a Band-Aid on a cut after the cut happens, but what are you doing to remove the item that's causing the cutting? And so I always say in terms of youth, we often don't bring youth into the conversation when we're talking about youth. How many spaces, how many meetings, how many discussions have we had where we're talking about how can we help our youth heal from trauma? How can we help our youth heal from all of this racial conflict? How can we help our youth bounce back from this COVID pandemic when there's no youth in the room? You know, the easiest way to figure out how to help our youth and how to better resource our youth is to ask the youth. And I find myself in many adult spaces where there are no youth, yet we're talking about how to resource a specific group of youth. And so it just baffles me how responsive our system is. And I think for me, the healing has to be proactive, right? You take vitamins to prevent sickness. You take all these things to prevent sickness. That's the same thing we have to build into our system. which has never been built into our system before, especially for marginalized groups. There's never been systems built in place to help support individuals in marginalized groups. We've always seen the system actually take on the opposite of that role, and the system has actually been harmful to all marginalized groups. And so we have to first take out those harmful parts of the system and probably even recreate the whole system itself, and then build in particular aspects of the system that are meant to prevent further harm. Because there's no sense in healing a wound that's just going to be recreated again. We've been in this cycle of continuous trauma, continuous exposure to conflict and to harm and to all of this traumatic experiences, but it's not going away. And so we keep trying to put band-aids on wounds that require much larger, much greater means of healing. And so, that the first thing to do is ask the patient, what's hurting, what's wrong. You would never go to a doctor's office and the doctor's trying to trying to take care of the patient, and the doctor doesn't talk to the patient, right? Like the first thing you say is, hey, what's hurting? What's hurting the most? Where's the injury? What do you feel I need to treat first? And a lot of times when you ask those kinds of questions, you will get the most immediate answer. Instead of putting a band-aid on the scrape on my elbow, doctor, I can't feel my legs, right? So we have to take healing as a proactive word and stop thinking of it as this reactive after the fact scenario. And I think that'll benefit not only youth, but even larger, every marginalized group in the nation. I think we need to build those into our system. Thank you.
Thank you. And Shalain, your thoughts?
Yeah, so when I think about healing individually, similar to some of the words that we saw in that 400-word sort of video that kind of played for us, healing for me really is to make whole again. It's a measure of restoration of something that may have been lost as a result of trauma. It's the success and understanding that one is not defined by trauma, but affected by it. And when we move towards talking about healing-centered engagement, it allows us to consider not just the person, but the environment. So healing-centered engagement takes on this sort of socio-ecological level approach and explores social inequities, institutional inequities, and takes into account community level issues such as living conditions, access to resources, et cetera. So when you hear Dr. Shawn Ginwright, who, I call him sort of this father of healing-centered engagement at this point, when he talks about the presence of a persistent traumatic stress environment and how those social toxins really, and for example, a social toxin could be racism, colorism, ableism, but it's the exposure to those toxins simultaneously that impact an individual, their interpersonal relationships and their community and their institutions within the community. But in identifying those toxins present in the community, it gives us an opportunity through healing-centered engagement to explore also what assets exist in that community in order to foster healing. So we know beliefs influence structures, which create patterns, which lead to events that require a response. So how is it that a community is responding to its adversities? How can those institutions in the community assist in the response that solves the problem and simultaneously also fosters healing? How do we build empathy within community stakeholders that's evident in their response to community adversity? And so when we talk about examples of healing-centered engagement in practice on a community level, my mind automatically is drawn to the notion of community policing and credible messengers. So Dr. Ginwright gives this example in one of his presentations regarding some work that he did with the Richmond, Virginia Police Department. And so they use credible messengering to de-escalate youth that were known to carry guns, which in turn thereby reduced shootings. So they did it by forming relationship with these youth that was so meaningful that they instructed the youth to give them a call anytime that they felt like they were going to go out and potentially shoot somebody. And the youth did. The youth did. When they would then meet up with the youth, oftentimes grab something to eat, and in that interaction, de-escalate the situation enough to avoid that youth from committing a shooting. That's healing-centered engagement. It's utilizing empathy and relationship to invoke immediate change in a course of action. Another example, which has been a super hot topic as of late, is mental health professionals responding to mental health crises involving youth instead of the police. Healing-centered engagement would say it's responding, it's the presence of those mental health professionals instead of the police that allows us to respond with what we know is needed instead of just throwing anything at a situation and hoping for the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Walter.
Yes, well, you know, I think that for me, the healing word is unconditional. And I say that because I have come to, and this is my own assessment, one of the major problems in our community is love scarcity. And that goes along with poverty. And when you don't have, there's always lack. So there's lack of money, there's lack of food, there's lack of resources. And mainly there's a lack of love because those people who are trying to provide for your well-being are so taxed and beat down from other aspects of trying to cope with the systems that are affecting them. So one of the main things that our youth feel is a love scarcity, that they're not getting that what they need to make them feel like they are loved unconditionally. And so what happens is because of it, what it does is it puts something in our community in terms of a thought system that we feel we deserve not to be loved, or we feel we deserve for these things to happen to us, because a child can sometimes look out of the lens and blame themselves. If the parents break up or there's all kind of disruption, they wind up blaming themselves for it. When the gentleman was the keynote speaker was talking about the young man that killed another man because his father had, I don't know if he said he died or what happened to the father, but how he then began to implode and start to become very negative in his behavior. But there's a pattern to all of this that we all begin to suffer from. And so therefore we have to understand what's really going on in our community rather than just understand. So I think the love scarcity. And then the other aspect is that we have to start to create new systems. You know, most of our leaders have said that we have to build and take control of the institutions in our community. So what we have to do is we have to begin to build structures that give our youth a sense of their own importance. If I'll give an example of what we've been working on. We started to work on some program that we're building now, and we're calling it OI, occupations instead of incarceration. And what we're doing is we're dealing with certain areas where youth can learn how to do a trade, say in the areas of banking, landscaping, and silk screening. But not only just how to do it, but how to do it as a business, how to become an entrepreneur, how to be able to circulate money among the community so it doesn't go out in 6 hours. So the way we are doing it is we are now teaching them with the baking program. They can then begin to see not only that the products that they've created, but now we have a booth down in the farmer's market so that they can sell it. So they're seeing the business and what it takes to be able to do things. We started a University of Success program because we found most people in our community don't know what success looks like. And so therefore, they're making it up as they go along. Some think it's money, think it's jewels, a house, whatever. But it's usually things outside themselves. So how do we give people the feeling of their own importance? Nobody is a nobody. But a lot of times our youth are not told that, so they feel more like nobodies than somebodies. And a lot of the systems continue to impact them, making them feel that. So we have to do that. And then just one last thing, like sometimes when we're dealing with these youth, a lot of times they don't know how to verbalize. They haven't found their voice yet. So they don't know always how to speak about what is really going on in their life. So we asked them to tell us 2 stories. Tell me the story about a little boy and a teenager. If they're older, then we'll add a man. Tell me 3 stories. Make it up. Once upon a time, there was a little boy. And as they begin to talk about this, at first it becomes funny to once upon a time, but after a moment, the story becomes real because you cannot help but tell your own story. And we have found that most of the time, when they were little boys, the problems already had started. And by the time they got to teenagers, they was acting out what had impacted them before they became the teenager. So I think that it's how we start to look at our youth and look at them through the eyes of unconditional love that we'll be able to heal a lot of the trauma that they've experienced. Thank you.
Thank you. John, we're gonna bring you in once again, and we'll shift things a little bit for the next question.
Yes,
We'll
yes.
have you
I
begin
just,
as well.
yeah, I just wanted to lift up that for healing for me, it really is about bringing peace to situations. And one of the things that I was thinking about is that a lot of times when we're talking about a person seeking healing or experiencing healing, one of the things you very rarely talk about is that when someone is trying to heal, especially from traumatic experience, whether it's an individual, even communities go through this kind of a feeling like traumatic experience and they suffer trauma. It's important for us to get a certain level of respite because you are trying to heal, but yet and still there's still more trauma that's being visited on. And so the thing for me is, especially from my auspices or from my vantage point, from my perch, the thing that I always think is that we have an onus to try to create order where there's disorder. We have to give people an opportunity to heal. We have to facilitate the ability for folks to find those spaces to heal. You know, there's a lot of conflict that exists in these communities and in our society right now. There's conflict everywhere you turn. There's conflict. We see, you know, and the thing that we need to do, especially as system stakeholders, of which I am, we need to start to find those ways that we can structure environments or environs where folks can find, or folks can see, folks can feel healing. It's one thing for us to always talk about, you know, what happened to you. I know that that's been the catchphrase for several years now. What happened to you? What was it that created the person that you are right now, and why you are behaving in the manner that you are behaving? We've understood that, but now we need to facilitate a move towards, like Shalain had said, we need to focus a move towards folks getting better than they were, communities being better than they are. We need to really start to focus our lens on that community and that healing in that community, allowing folks to be a powerful partner in their own plan for healing. Right. And you know, because you can't, and one of the things that's interesting to me is that you go to see a doctor and they ain't try to give you a prescription on how you can get better. But at the end of the day, how you get better is based upon how you handle what has been given to you. Like if I broke my ankle last year, and if I had just started to continue to run on it, you know, play basketball on it, never get a cast on it, it would have never healed. So, but we need to facilitate all that. And I think that from my perspective, listening to our panelists is, you know, let's start to really think about how is it that we as systems can facilitate folks getting the healing that they need now that we know what happened to them.
Thank you, John. I'm going to ask that you stay with us. And since you kind of brought up bringing it back home, and I'm going to ask you the question about it. Let's focus on New York. And it seems that we've arrived at this place where some communities, as well as some justice systems, as well as stakeholders, want to move forward, as you mentioned. This intersection can create some opportunities as well as tensions.
Right.
So what are the ways forward that you see specifically?
Right.
And what are some of the key considerations that need to take place for collaboration?
Right.
Between
For me,
systems and community.
Yes. And for me, tension is okay. I mean, tension is okay in the sense that if you keep moving past the tension, right? You speak to the elephant that's in the room, you get everybody on the same page, you try very hard to give people equal power in that environment, whatever safe space or whatever container that exists, you try very hard to allow everybody to know that I'm in this space and my word has value just as much as the next person. And I think that the thing that we sometimes tend to forget is that no one person, no one system, no one agency, right? No one organization can do this. We can't allow ourselves to continue to be in silos. We can't think that we got it right. The system is not the parent. The parent is the parent. The system doesn't have all of the answers. However, we can be a helpful partner in this process, because what we want to do is create a level, a field or a playing field where folks can thrive. I think that the thing that I'm seeing so much now that I'm heartened by is because we're at a point, this is an inflection point for me, where there's tremendous opportunity. Folks' ears are perked, right? Folks' eyes are fastened, right? A lot of people are able to speak now who never thought they could speak before. We're seeing things in a way that we never saw them before, with the advent of video, with all of the things that we've seen. I know sometimes it's horrific to see, but at the end of the day, these things were happening in the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, and on. I had stories that my grandfather told me about Mississippi. So the point is that we're in a point where as long as we seek peace, as long as we seek understanding amongst all parties and give people power, I think we're going to miss an opportunity to move to another level with our communities, because right now is a great time for us to act. Absolutely.
Thank you. Saafir, I know that you mentioned, especially earlier, as a way to moving forward is to make sure we're including the voices of our youth at the starting point of that conversation. What else might you add in terms of your thoughts about how we move forward, as well as any thing specifically around key considerations and collaborating with communities, with youth in these dialogues?
Yeah, I think I would just say that, when it comes to moving forward, I think we just need to we need to make sure that everybody has an idea of what the priorities are, right? Like, I think, when we hold the system that we're trying to create as more important than the community that the system is meant to serve, that's where the problems occur. And so we've seen this time and time again, where we try to maintain the system more so than we try to address the needs of the community. And I think that is the number one problem in every area of our lives. And for youth, the most important to me is the education system. We keep trying to visit all of these laws and all of these rules and all of these, curriculum and all of these other stuff, but we're not looking at the needs of the community. What do the youth need? Because in my experience, it's not the academics that is most important for the youth, right? So what things are we providing to the community that they need that is more important than the system, more important than that system being upheld? And we've seen through the pandemic that the education system failed because the system wasn't designed to support the needs of the youth. It was designed to support a different agenda that people had set as a priority without even asking the individuals that they were trying to serve. So when we talk about collaboration and collaborative work, there's a whole lot of components that come into mind when you talk about collaborative work, but at the top of that list for me is listening. The number one thing in collaborative work is first listening, not speaking, not, doing, but listening. How are we listening? People just think that, when we listen, we're often listening for a response so that we can respond to what someone is saying. But no, are you internalizing what that person is saying? Are you giving that person the space to truly express how they feel and what they need before you respond? Because oftentimes when you listen just to give a response to someone, you're not giving an effective response. And so I think, and this happens all the time, especially with our youth, we often think that we have the answers that our experience is often the answer that our youth need for all of their problems. And that's just not true. Right. And so I think when we make decisions moving forward, we need to be aware that the decisions we make as adults will affect the youth more prominently than they'll ever affect us. Right. And so in restorative practices, we bring a lot of these practices from our Native American brothers and sisters. And so in the Native American, the teaching of the good mind, they say that, you know, all of the things that are happening to you now are results in large part due to the decisions made 7 generations ago, right? Your ancestors impact you 7 generations before you, right? So what decisions are we making now? What decisions are we making that will affect our youth 7 generations from now? I'm talking about laws. I'm talking about education. I'm talking about police brutality. I'm talking about all of these things. We've already affected 7 generations. George Floyd, his bloodline is affected for 7 generations because of a decision made by a system that wasn't correct, right? And so we need to look at how we are listening to our community more so than we are trying to build a system, right? The system, the community should drive what the system should look like, right? And so we need to listen to that community and hear what kind of system they want before we just start building a system and then say, oh, well, we forgot this. Oh, we forgot this. Oh, we forgot, because we've already done that. We've been there, we've done that. Let's listen to the community's needs first, and then let's work together, lawmakers, systems people with community in building a system that is equitable for everyone. And we haven't seen a lot of equity. We've seen more equality than we've seen equity. And so, you know, I'm a big fan of giving people what they need to be successful instead of giving everyone the same tools, because not everyone needs the same tools. If I need a screwdriver and not a hammer, don't give me a hammer, right? Like, you know, we have to be thinking in the mind of equity and listening, and that's what collaborative work is. And the community that the system is meant to serve is more important than upholding the system. And so we need to be thinking about how to better the communities, because that will affect everything. I'm complete.
Thank you, Saafir. You're getting the audience fired up. So we're looking forward to our question and answer periods soon. I'm just gonna ask that let's see, we're going to, who's up next? See, that's what happens when you go out of order. And then, yes, thank you, Shalain. You're keeping me straight.
Yeah. You know, I'm not going to say much different from what John and Saafir already touched on. Like, to me, the most key consideration for collaborative work and communities is the question of who's at the table, and is there authentic engagement occurring? When we talk about engagement, especially when it comes to healing, there needs to be a level of empowerment that the group of people you are looking to impact feels not just to be present, but to speak and find tangible value in their voice. For effective collaboration, you know, I saw it in the chat that there has to be this nothing for us, without us precedent set. We need to understand that we cannot effectively program, create policy or anything without the knowledge of how it will affect the people that it's targeted to. And we get that best understanding by having those conversations with the people that are part of that community and in that environment daily. And when you bring that back to healing-centered engagement, that's the principle of agency. It's the ability to engage the community in strength-based approach to solving their community problems. We have to start getting away from saying that we have community and youth engagement simply because they're sitting at the table. That's not enough. Is their voice being heard? Are they able to speak? Are they being overlooked? You know, and it's also tangible things like considering if you're expecting youth and family voice at the table, but you only have your meetings during 9 to 5, when there's a hindrance of participation because the family may have to go to work in their school, right? Opportunities don't happen, we create them. Healing doesn't happen, you create a space where you provide safety that allows a person enough room to build a relationship with them to change a person from believing that they are defined by their trauma and that there's no life past it. And so when you talk about this tension, you know, healing-centered engagement tells us that we can begin to combat some of this tension by using relationship. Are we looking at transformative relationships based on trust and servant leadership? Or are we just going into communities with the transactional approach, thinking about us and what we can get versus what we can give? Are we cultivating true connections with community members in key community spaces? Are we meeting the communities where they are? Are we providing that safe space for thought and collaboration? Or are we just showing up like former NFL player Marshawn Lynch used to say, I'm just here so I don't get fined? Are we showing up just because we're paid to do so? I firmly believe that you cannot do this work without the investment in the community and whom the work is targeted to impact. And you can't have that investment without relationship. Thank you.
Thank you. Walter, and your thoughts around community kind of fostering this relationship?
Well, you know, like, Lani, first I have to say that I feel like this panel is some kind of collective consciousness, because everything everybody is saying, it's like I'm saying, right. Okay, so it's like there's a one thought system that's going on here that is being presented by different levels and areas of understanding. And all I can do is back up what a lot has been already said from the panel, which is the fact of inclusion, because it's who's at the table where the decisions are being made. And most of the time, the people who are affected are not at the table. And people are saying what they're providing for you, but never asking you whether or not that's really what you wanted. The other thing I'd like to really touch on also too is, as well as inclusion, succession. In our community, we have so many knowledgeable, educated people of color, but sometimes we hold on to our information until we die. And then somebody will come behind us and they've got to learn everything we already experienced because we never passed it on. And we have to have a level. When I started to watch the Black Lives Matter movement, okay? Well, first of all, because of my incapacity to be breathing for long periods of time walking, I couldn't get into none of the marches. But I saw how powerful this was with these young people doing this. But again, I've seen back in the 60s, the marching and everything else. So, you know, like all of a sudden it was like something new that happened. Wait a minute, hold on. We didn't just start marching, we've been marching. But what I saw was, it was the next generation taking the baton and marching forward. So what I started to realize, and my people in the community started to say, well, a lot of these people are young and they don't really have experience in leadership. They have it in the cause that they're marching for and how they feel about it, but they have to have an understanding of what it means to be a leader. So then what we decided to do was start a community leadership boot camp, so people can learn what are the principles of leadership that they need to know, because you can get before a crowd, start firing them up, and the next thing you know, you got an uncontrolled energy running up and down the street. And therefore, then what is going to happen is a lot of people are going to get hurt or go to jail, and you're going home saying, well, listen, I'm sorry you got out of control. Well, you have to understand that when the civil rights movement was going on, they had places to teach people how to go through and get water hosed and dogs and all that stuff. They were safe houses for that to happen. We have to create this for the next generation, that they have to be able to understand that there's a responsibility that goes with this. And I'm not saying that some of them don't know it, but as a community, we have to teach the community how to be leaders, because we don't need just one leader that they can knock off or deport or send to jail or whatever they do. We need leaders that can step up no matter what happens to the one before them. So the only way we can do it is start to teach them and educate people on the things they need to do. But they have to get sometimes a lot of that from the people who already has experienced this and who can give them the do's and don'ts. You know, it's like the principles and problems that they're going to face. And being a leader is no easy task, especially not in our community, because there's a fear base to it, because we think we're all going to get killed if we step out in leadership, because a lot of times we do. But at the same time, how do we be leaders and we conduct our people to move them forward with decency and order so that they can really do what has to be done? Because we're dealing with some forces here that have been entrenched and they are not giving up. The battle of the 21st century is the battle of the minds of the people. And they're fighting hard, okay? And this goes past political affiliations and all that kind of stuff, because there's a new leadership coming in. And when we're watching it, we're watching the first become last, the last become first, and the first becoming last. And the first who's starting to go last, they don't like it. And they are fighting for something that is in the consciousness of what they're needing for their children to continue to be leaders of the so-called free world. And for us to be able to step into that place to show them what leadership in the free world really looks like. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, Walter. Some great perspectives, and looking forward to further conversation. So as we move into question 4, I'm going to ask that both John and Shalain address this question ahead. Within youth justice work, practitioners and policymakers have spent the last several years building trauma-informed practices and responsiveness. Talk with us regarding this systems level approach toward healing center engagement. Maybe share your thoughts on what might be different regarding this approach, and how does it relate to promoting individual and community well-being, while at the same time working towards eliminating racial and ethnic disparities and serving children in systems. And it may be that you may not agree with the question I just answered, but it just love to hear both of you all's perspective, whoever chooses to go first.
Go ahead, Shalain. You know we talk often, so go ahead.
Well, thanks, John. You know, I think I thought sort of long and hard about this question, but I think the first step in the systems levels move towards healing centered engagement is really the understanding of what it really is, in that it's a mental model and a change in perspective of how we create policies and programs, while acknowledging also that we oftentimes can create policies and programs that do more harm than good, right? And it's that notion of, are we ready to move past the question of just asking what happened to what's right? That strength-based approach, that asset building, what's right in spite of what happened to you. And I think no matter what system you go, it's going to look very differently, but the principles will remain the same, in the sense that there has to be some level of transformational relationship no matter where you sit within the system. If you're like John and I at sort of a policy level, or if you're more sort of in the field. And I think that, you know, Dr. Jenwright talks about this probation department that he worked with in California, and how when they were looking to employ healing centered engagement, they examined their hiring practices. And what they realized was that they tended to hire people that were more militaristic and that were more concerned about punishing youth than developing youth.
Right. Yeah.
Doing that, they understood that they need to shift from people viewing youth as needing to be punished. And they shifted their hiring practice to include a look for people who had youth development or a social work background. And with that, in hiring those people, their case planning shifted from what just the judge ordered for the youth to do, because it was just in their orders and conditions, but to focusing on aligning the youth with the actual resources that they needed, and future planning and exposure to different things that may change their course. And so you do that with they did that with new hires, but then the question becomes, what do you do with the people that are existing in your agency? How do you then train them to see youth as needing development and not, and not punishment? And I think, again, like the difference really is the ability to, the difference in this model and looking at healing centered engagement is the ability to really create authentic engagement. I harp because it's so important. And again, the focus on relationship and the understanding that just as hurt people, healed people, heal people. And takes that notion of healing centered engagement and pushes the lens on also the practitioner, which we don't talk enough about, and understanding that the practitioner's healing and well-being is equally as important as the healing they're trying to affect in a youth or whomever they are talking to.
Go
ahead.
I'm sorry, you want to finish?
No, go ahead.
And one of the things that I often think about when talking about systems levels and folks that I work with and folks that I have had the opportunity to be on projects with, whether at the local level, at the state level, what have you, even at the community level. I would challenge everybody that's on this actual webinar just to think about this, it's an Ubuntu term, and it is, I am because we are. And so a lot of times what you see, or what I've seen through my travels, through my career in juvenile justice, is there's this tendency to look at those that are in the struggle, those that are the young people that are placed with us, the families that are associated with those young people, the communities where those young people come from. That is, those three pockets are outside and extraneous to me, right? That's them, and we got to help them. We got to give them some money. We got to stop them from killing each other. And I'm saying that we have a different approach, right? Even at the system level, I am because we are. So it's not them, it's us. We got to help us get better. Right? We got to help us stop killing each other. We got to, once we start to have that frame, and it doesn't cost anything for you to change your frame. Maybe it costs you in the sense of you give up a little power, you give up a little, a safety that lets you be able to to compartmentalize the experiences of those, but understand that no chain is as strong as its weakest link. We have to support those that are without, because they are actually within our country, right? They're within our real community. We just want to put them in a pocket. We want to put them in a box when that box really doesn't exist. We are all interconnected. I think that one of the things that I think that you can really address racial and ethnic disparities when folks start to realize those disparities are affecting us, not them. Right? The fact that all of these predominant, like in a lot of our agencies, a lot of our juvenile justice systems, they're predominantly populated by people of color, right? Kids of color, male and female. And unfortunately, a lot of our young girls are starting to get into the system a lot more than they really, really should. But that's, that I know that's something that we need to really address. But the point is that it's still us. You may think it's them, but it's us. And I think that when we start to approach that, and how can you talk about us if all of us aren't in the room, right? And how can you decide on a plan when your plan, you think of like, let's develop a plan for them. No, that's not what we do. And so I think that as we move forward, I think one of the most important things for system stakeholders, those that have some ability to create policy and practice, and if we want to do it from a healing-centered approach, we need to realize that community is important. That is our communities. We need to support those communities. We need to look at those communities, bring them in, create safe space for them, give them the mic, walk away from the mic, let them have the mic, and talk to us about what it is that they need in order to be healed just like everyone else. So that's how I feel. That's all I have.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you,
Lonnie, if I could just say one thing to
of
what
course.
you said, I think it's incredibly important, and Professor Gary Younge talked about this in his remarks earlier. A lot of disparities are exacerbated by the fact that we don't view everybody as humans. If we can get this notion that we are all human beings and treat each other as such, we'll begin to realize that there are needs in each community that need to be addressed by everybody. So I think that kind of goes to what John was saying, in that if we just look at this as an us mentality and not a just them mentality, we can begin to affect system change.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, wow. I'm excited. I hope everyone else is. So I'm going to address this last question for the panelists, to Walter and Saafir. So in appreciation of the various multi-generational viewpoints you've offered today, and then moving into and designing a future that offers individuals and communities a sense of well-being to the community, how do you advise each other's generations or other generations, because we're in between some generations here, how what would you advise them about moving forward? It's kind of expanding on the last question. So Walter, we'll begin with you.
Well, Alice Walker wrote a book called We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For. And I think that's what we have to see in ourselves, that there's no people that's coming to save us. We're the ones that are going to have to save ourselves in our communities. And we're the ones that are going to have to step up and move everything forward, because otherwise what we're going to do is we're going to remain full of fear and anxiety, and that's going to give us a different pandemic, which will be just as much a lockdown as the lockdown that went on because of COVID. But what I really kind of really look at that goes on also in I view more things from a community lens. And in my community lens, what I kind of have started to really kind of understand, a gentleman came and he was facilitating our University of Success classes by the name of Warren Mackey. And Warren used to say at every class, there are two no's. There's an N-O and there's a K-N-O-W. And you get an N-O because there's no K-N-O-W. And what I found was in our groups and in our associations with one another, we may know each other because we go to the same church, school, or grocery store, or live in the same buildings or on the same block, but we don't know each other. And therefore, there's always this question of unity in the community. Why can't we get organized? Why can't we be unified like other communities? And the actuality is that there has been a effort to keep us from being connected to one another. We're educated to distrust each other. So then our children are educated to distrust us. And so what happens is all of this does is continue to add to the misinformation and the lack of real knowledge that is people need in order to move forward. And if you don't understand who you are, then you don't understand what you're really here to do. So we have to be able to create some things that create models. We have to start creating models for urban America, because if we can solve certain problems in one community, that might fit in another community, especially in urban communities, because a lot of us are located in urban centers. So we are jammed together, and we are policed almost identical no matter what area you may be in, and it could be appear to be rural, but you're still treated the same way. So a lot of our problems are problems that we all go through as a people, and we share those same wounds. And when we talk about healing, we need to heal a consciousness for people of color, because we have to be able to understand and understand that this is bigger than us individually, and that each one of us individually is going to heal and make better all of us as a collective. So we have to start thinking of that. The last thing I want to do is, I'm going to go back because I'm a child of the 60s. And there was this thing, Ron Karanga, Milano Ron, the professor, he came up with Nguza Saba, or the 7 principles of Blackness. And in those 7 principles of Blackness that they burn candles for during Kwanzaa celebrations, these are principles that really our community could work with, like the 10 Commandments did for the people in the Judaic religions. And therefore, we could be able to start with unity. And the other principles of collective work and responsibility and cooperative economic, these are things that if we started to apply these in our communities and in ourselves individually, it would eliminate a lot of the things that we feel that have kept us different from one another. So that's what I think has to happen. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate when we talk about multi-generational viewpoints, I think one thing we need to think about is how do we preserve experience, right? And so, Walter, he's coming in with a whole lot of experience from things that I wasn't even alive for, right? You talk about the 60s, I wasn't born until 99. And so when we think about multi-generational viewpoints, we need to be incorporating all of these generational viewpoints when we talk about our experience and how that's preserved and how that's passed down. I think about just this weekend, we were remembering the Tulsa massacre and how, my dad's 71 and he had never heard of it, right? Like, so how are we preserving these experiences and learning from them? And how are we passing that on to the next generation? What am I saying? What am I not only saying, but what am I showing my little brothers and sisters about my experience? And we need to be careful about how we share our experience and how we portray our experience and how we behave from our experience. Because one thing I know about trauma is that if you're not careful, the harm that you were harmed from, if you take that injury and you present it to someone below you, you might end up bleeding on that person unintentionally. And so how do I present this traumatic wound to the people after me without bleeding on them? How am I showing them my experience without causing more harm? And so I think when we talk about multi-generational viewpoints, we need to communication is so essential between generations. And, I wouldn't, if it weren't for all the stories that my dad and my parents have passed down to me, that is a wealth of knowledge that we need to continue to flow like a river down the chain. And I think as I get older, I'm learning to appreciate more and more that knowledge, but also taking that knowledge and using what I've experienced for myself as fuel to create change. And so it's not any one generation that's going to solve the issue. It's the connectedness between all of the generations that will solve the majority of our problems. And I think, even on this panel, you have so many different viewpoints and so many different perspectives and so many different time periods of perspective that, it's important that we continue to incorporate different generational viewpoints into our solution. And not only for just the systems, but even further than just the systems, being as people, right? Like, that's how history has been. In history, that's how for me, my Black African-American, tradition is passing down through stories, right? Like, so I think it's important that we look at our past for knowledge, and we look to our future as we use the tools from the past to help us build better tools to fight for the future. And like I said before, 7 generations before is affected, right? So I'm hearing things, I'm feeling things from 7 generations before, and the decisions I'm making now is going to affect 7 generations later. So we need to work together to provide that next 7 generation the best chance possible. And so how are Walt and I working together to provide that next 7 generations after the latest generation the best chance possible? What are we doing? What are we saying? What are we presenting? What do our history books look like? What does our education system look like? What experience can we provide that can better the next 7 generations? And I think that's the essence of, back to that proactive healing, right? We need to be proactive, even intergenerationally. How are we being proactive for the next generation, right? And one of the best quotes I had during RA training my freshman year or my sophomore year of college is, "What's your why?" Right? That was the question. There was no response, nothing else. What's your why? Right? And so why are you fighting for what you're fighting for? Why are you in the space that you are in? Why are you there? What's your purpose? When we think about that, the answer becomes much more clear. And so I think when we talk about multi-generational stuff, what's your why? Right? And Walt's why might be a little different than mine, but I think overall we're going to find that there are common denominators among our why, and we just need to figure out how to get to that same goal together. And so I think listening and that collaborative piece is so important between generations, because it's not only going to be us that are affected, like I said, the 7 generations behind us. And so I'm complete.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Much appreciation to all of our panelists. This is the time that we move into the question and answer period. So everyone will be asked to turn on their cameras. Thank you. I'll be reading from the questions that are posted in the question and answer. So please, if you have not had a chance, please include your questions. While we don't have a lot of time, we have enough time. So I'm going to ask that for those who may answer the question, keep your answer short. The first question that arose was about, how do you advise us teachers, school teachers, K through 12, around students' social emotional needs to help them establish a healthy, healing mindset so that they can learn? Where do we begin following these pandemics?
Well, my answer would be that I think outside of ourselves and try to find connection to community, try to create spaces for those young people to be able to express how they feel, what's going on with them, connect them to organizations that can do that, work with other people to help you in your environment to get your job done. And we are more powerful when we combine ourselves with others. And so I would reach out, use your help. There's help available, find it and use it. And there are a lot of, especially young people, Saafir's and Shalain's age, who are itching to help wherever the help is needed. Trust, that is definitely the case.
Saafir, did you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, I was just going to say, relationship with your students is the most important thing, right? Like, and knowing the conditions that they're coming from is also important, right? And so as an educator, a student, you should know that a student, they're not going to be perceptive to anything if they come in and they haven't eaten, or they had a rough bus ride, or there are things going on at home that they can't control, or I've been up all night helping my little brother do his homework that I didn't get my homework done, right? And so I think it's just being aware and being not intrusive, but asking those kinds of questions, right? Like how can I set up my student to be in the mindset to learn? Because a lot of times students come in and their priority is not learning. Like, you know what I mean? Like you have to be perceptive to that. So, what resources can I use? Like John said, how do I reach out? Who can I pull on? What resources can I use to help these youth be in the mind space to learn?
Thank you. Another question, go ahead. Well,
okay, I just wanted to say, because Shalain had spoke about something earlier, and that's when she was talking about credible messengers. And what we have to do is have more credible messengers working with our youth, because you have to have somebody who understands them and somebody who they will respect and listen to and knows that they feel that they understand and they're on the same page. So I think that credible messenger, when she mentioned that, was very important to be a factor in all areas of our social workings that go on here in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Yes, and I think that kind of goes into the next question that I was going to bring up that came up. The statement that was made by one of our attendees that said, nothing for us without us. And that goes to that credible messenger. So maybe Shalain, you can follow up with that. So how do we meaningfully engage and involve youth in this work we do, especially when we get into this area of policy? And most of the time, larger institutions feel like they are the stakeholder, the provider, the receiver, and sometimes they place themselves in the consumer because they answer the question that they want to answer versus turning to the person who's in need of the healing. So Shalain, I know you can answer that powerfully.
I spoke a little bit about this before when I was talking about meaningful and authentic engagement and creating the space and removing the barriers for people to be at the table. And also when they're at the table, again, encouraging them to speak and not just be passed over, just to check a mark on, on a paper saying that you have community and authentic engagement. And I think that once we begin to remove those barriers for youth and families to participate, but consciously remove them, right? Like make the effort to remove them. Like I gave the example of saying, like, stop just having meetings in a 9-to-5 forum, right? Just to check a box and say, we invited them, but they couldn't come. They were at work or they were at school. And also meet them where they are. Like what's stopping you from having a meeting in the community that you're trying to affect? If the center of the community is the school, have the meeting at the school. If the center of the community is the YMCA, have the meeting at the YMCA. And also open the doors. A lot of times when we're talking about policy and we're talking about, programs and things, it's a closed door conversation. But yet we're supposed to affect this wide range of people. Open the door, allow them to come in and see what you're trying to do, hear what you're trying to do, and also give their input on what you're trying to do, because it's them who you are affecting. And if we can't create those spaces, we won't have the engagement and we won't know that what we are creating isn't doing more harm than it is good.
I'm reminded of in my experience, like I brought a group of system stakeholders to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we heard from the folks that do the work on juvenile justice in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we went to an organization, La Placita, in Albuquerque, and the gentleman that runs that organization said, in order for him to collaborate with system stakeholders, they had to come where he was. So they had to come to his outfit. And whatever it is, it's not the greatest place, it's not the worst place, but the district judge came. The head of probation came. Other system stakeholders came there for meetings, and the meetings were at 6 o'clock at night so that the youth and family could come as well. And everybody was told, your voice is heard here, don't worry about it. So that's what just
Appreciate that, John. You muted yourself prior, but yes, we appreciate that comment. So I'm gonna we have time for one last question, and I'm gonna take this question and mold it into answer another. And that question really is, because I think that our researchers and our providers, both hand in hand, as well as policymakers, are just as important, because often our researchers make up the stories that get put out there publicly. So I think that we should answer this question. One of our audience members asked, what work do we believe researchers should be doing in this area? What sorts of questions should they be asking? And I say this to wrap it up with one question a person asked me specifically about my work with women of color in my role as a therapist, but also I can speak to myself as a researcher, as a scholar. And I know in particular for brown and Black women, we haven't talked a lot about specifically about gender, in particular for girls. We understand where that current pipeline from what we thought was a K through 12 education is now leading to that same prison pipeline. So they're making sure that we all get caught in that pipeline, right? So what work do we need to do specifically when it comes to gender and being better at acknowledging what our brown and Black girls need, what their mothers need, what their grandmothers need who are raising, in addition to fathers, husbands, brothers and uncles in our communities. We know in particular around, I know in particular around Black girls and brown girls and women that there has to be that space to talk about the challenge, not only the challenge of being placed by society into a space where they have to feel as if they have to be everything. And we ask, well, how does this shift the way we engage and heal? I think, again, going back to what Walter mentioned earlier, no one knows their story. We don't hear the voices of these persons, of not necessarily by the youth who's being directly impacted, but by the parents who are behind that impact. As you know, in Albany recently, where a young lady, high school young lady was killed, and a young man who made a wrong decision, mistake, he knew the young lady, but killed her, and now he's going to prison. I think I know this young man since he was 5, but I think about his parents. Lisa Good does some great work, but I can see their pain of what they tried to do for their son. I can see his mother's pain as where she tried to raise him and where he ended up. So we have to do better at not just including youth in those conversations, but making sure those mothers and fathers and uncles and aunts are at the table, and sometimes removing those policymakers and other decision makers from that middle of that conversation, even if we're in government institutions. So I say, to answer that question around Black and brown women, that we have to begin to, just like any of us, insert ourselves in the conversation. We've been way too passive, and we have to insert our story, insert our uniqueness around need, and not feel as we're the torchbearers of the conversation, but insert. Otherwise, people are guessing, researchers are guessing what you think or believe, rather us directing the way in which that story goes and the money that is allocated to provide those services. So I'll open it up quickly before we end to the rest of the panelists, if you'd like to add anything in terms of what directions researchers should go in.
I just would like to say that I've had some wonderful experience with our researchers, and maybe I'm a little biased, but our researchers in DCJS and in OCFS, and the reason why is because they listen. They're in the space and they listen to what it is that we're trying to articulate. The issues are, whether it be, I'm reminded of a researcher and her partner in the Albany area deciding that they were just going to go meet with community folk, like go to where the people are, go to the barbershop. And this is a researcher, go to the barbershop, go places and listen to what people are saying. And then that gives you insight to know not only what system takers are saying, but other people are saying, so that you get a more precise way to get that data that we all need so very, very much. So listen would be great.
Thank you. Listen.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think that also it goes to this notion of participatory research, right? And you getting people actually who are having or being affected by the system at the table to tell you their experience. A lot of times research We know what the numbers say, but what is the actual experience? How far deep are we diving into the experience of Black and brown girls? How far deep are we diving into the school system to figure out what the source of the push out for Black and brown girls is? Are they being penalized, for hair, nails, things that are different? Are they being penalized and then pushed out because they are different or because this is how they express themselves? We have the institution of the Crown Act that was just recently passed that says that that is now illegal to discriminate against that. But are they still finding ways around that, right? Just to say, like, you're out of dress code now because I decide to wear my hair in dreads today. So I think it's this notion of really being able to have the honest and authentic conversations with people to understand their honest and authentic experience in the system and as they walk through their daily life. We know Black and brown girls have one of the highest ACEs, right? Adverse Childhood Experiences scores that enter into the system. And so if we're not doing anything to acknowledge and sort of begin to address that, they're going to remain in the system hurt because no one is helping them heal. So I think that we have to really understand that we won't be able to do anything effective unless we really have the authentic engagement and participation and understanding of the stories of the people that we are looking to affect the change for.
Thank you. As we move towards the end of our time, let me take this quick moment just to say thank you. I appreciate you. Your responses have made me more reflective, and I'm sure for the rest of the audience, I will take each and every one of each of you's comments and your considerations as I move forward in my work with heart. There's a difference. I'm not taking it as on a piece of paper, black and white, but I'm taking it in heart so that I can continue to spread the word and make change at all systems levels in New York State and beyond. You all are much appreciated. Thank you, everyone. Dr. Lopes.
Wow, that was a powerful discussion. Thank you so much, Lani. And let me start with an apology to you and a thank you. Apologies for inadvertently demoting you to associate professor. I know that this is a cardinal sin in academia, so let me set the record straight right now and properly acknowledge Professor Lani Jones.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. A big thank you also for your expert moderation of this panel and your wrapping up words. They warmed my heart, and I hope to do the same and take what we heard here with me in everything that I do, front and center. Thanks to each of our amazing panelists. I appreciate very much the point that Mr. Simpkins made about the collective consciousness vibe of this panel. I think it was this alignment in way of thinking that brought a lot of the energy to the discussion, and you got us all listening. Folks were fired up, and at some point here, the team will share the word cloud for today, which I believe you inspired a lot of empathy and understanding in our audience here, and I would say in Lani and I as well. So thanks for that. Saafir, I could listen to you all day. Thanks for your candid reminder that youth are watching how adults react to each other and that they are taking this into their soul. I appreciate that message as a parent, so thank you. Shalain, your eloquent explanation of healing-centered engagement. And I think that what I take away from your global message is this need for us all to consider healing, not just on the person or the individual level, but to really take on the environment and the community, right? And to your last point there on PAR, on participatory action research, thanks for reminding us, researchers like me, that we should be doing research with folks and not on folks. So thanks for that. Walter, love scarcity. I think that, and I do hope that youth are also love hungry, because many of us have lots of love to give. So thank you for putting that in our minds very much. John, I know you know this. I grew up in Brazil. Most of my family lives there. Brazil being, of course, along with India, one of the most COVID affected nations, right, globally. And you quoted the Ubuntu phrase, I am because we are. So you gave me at that moment some insight into my own blind spots, and I wanted to thank you for that. So let me explain. To extrapolate from what you said, I was on the phone the other day with my sister, and in reference to the pandemic, I said to her, she's in Rio, we're all in this together. And she called me out and she said, are we really? And her point was to remind me of the disparate access to the vaccine on a global level. It happened to be the day that my 16-year-old had gotten his shot, and our 75-year-old aunt had not even been able to get on the list to get the vaccination. So I think what she wanted to do in that moment, or that she did, was to remind me that marginalization is also a global event, right? And that healing looks different on that level also. So thank you so much to all of you and John for putting this right here in front of me. I appreciate it. Thanks also to each of you in the audience for your insightful questions and for joining us today and over the past 2 days. Our work at the YJI does not stop here on this topic. Over the next month or so, we plan to summarize the lessons from this forum and the advice of our experts into a brief, and that brief will be available in digital format in our microsite. The link to that microsite should magically appear in the chat right about now, and you can explore it at your own convenience. You'll also receive an email when everything is updated, along with a survey that we hope very much you'll have an opportunity to complete and give us constructive feedback if you participated in all days of the forum or just today. So with that, thanks everyone, and we look forward very much to having you again at future events at the YJI. Thank you.